Let's face it, photography as a hobby is expensive. Sure, there are hobbies out there which are way more expensive, but photography is not cheap at all. Like in many other areas, entry-level photography gear is relatively affordable, but it comes with its own set of limitations. On the other hand, professional gear, which is indeed better and can help you squeeze out the last bit of quality from your photo, is exponentially more expensive. That said, the price for things like lenses can be justified when you consider the complex production process and the high development costs involved. When I started photography as a teenager, I didn't have much money, and even today I can't afford all the gear I'd love to have because it's just way too expensive. Over the years, mostly through trial and error, I've learned what's worth spending money on in photography and what isn't, at least for me. I've found things where it's better to spend a little more to avoid surprises down the road, and other areas where you can save money or skip spending it altogether. After the intro, I will share where you can save money as a photographer and where it might be not worth spending money at all. So here's the intro, enjoy the video. Before we dive in, here's a quick note. These are insights I've gathered over more than 10 years in photography. The first few years, however, were purely as a hobby for me, but now I make a living from it. If you're curious about my background, check out my other video on my channel where I talk about who I am. I will link it up somewhere around here, I guess. Anyway, this is just my opinion in this video and my own experience. So if you disagree or have other ideas, feel free to share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about it. So let's start with the first gadget where you can save money on: overly expensive SD and memory cards. There are countless different SD cards out there. Some are super cheap, while others can cost you hundreds of dollars each. In general, when buying SD cards or any other storage media, it is important to focus on a good quality and a good brand. After all, the best camera in the world won't do much for you if your photos are lost due to a faulty memory card. So maybe I would skip this 10 terabyte fake SSD from AliExpress. But one of the key factors that drive up the price of SD cards is speed. Specifically the reading speed, but more importantly for photographers, the writing speed. Very fast memory cards can get quite expensive. The writing speed is always indicated with the V rating on the card. I usually go for SD cards with a certification of at least V30, which can write up to around 30 megabytes per second. This is not so much, considering a raw image from my Sony A7R Mark IV, for example, can get up to 120 megabytes per image. And indeed, there are much faster SD cards out there, for example, with a rating of 60 or 90 megabytes per second of writing speed. However, those faster cards are way more expensive, and I believe they aren't necessary for most people. Cameras also have an internal buffer that temporarily stores the photos before writing them to the SD card. I shoot weddings professionally, if you want so, and I often have to take many pictures in quick succession, but I've never had serious issues with the writing speed. Even recording 4K video has been no problem for me with these cards. And for most people, these cards, which are significantly cheaper than those with much faster writing speeds, should be more than enough, and you will save a lot of money. That said, exceptions might be those who want to film in 8K, for example, or take a large number of consecutive shots, like sports photographers, where data bottlenecks could actually become an issue. Another way to save money on storage media is by not always opting for the largest SD card. This is an added benefit. If a card fails, you won't necessarily lose all your photos from an entire trip. For example, you will just lose a portion of them. When I shoot for clients, I always have the data written simultaneously on 2 SD cards. But not all cameras have dual card slots, so I recommend not going for the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte SD card, but sticking with an SD card with like 128 gigs or maybe 256 gigs, something like that. This approach is not only safer for your photos, but it also saves you a lot of money. So let's move on to the next point, which is about batteries. From my experience, and I can only strongly advise this here at this point, don't spend money on cheap batteries. Cheap third-party batteries can let you down at really inconvenient times. Often the remaining battery life is displayed incorrectly, so you might think you have like 50% left of your battery and then it suddenly drops to 5%, leaving your camera almost dead. I've had this experience myself and it's really not so cool. That said, it doesn't mean that you should avoid third-party batteries altogether. For example, I bought these third-party batteries from SmallRig from my Sony a7R Mark IV. They were about $30 cheaper than the original Sony batteries, but in my experience, they last just as long and they are super reliable and they have a direct USB Type-C connection. This means I can charge the batteries much more easily on the go than with the original batteries charging station. Plus, I can run the camera on external power via a power bank while simultaneously charging the battery. So you can save money on batteries by not buying the original ones. But I definitely advise you against buying third-party batteries that just seem too cheap. In my example, an original battery for the Sony a7R IV costs you around $80, while my batteries, as I said, were around $50 each. However, there are batteries for my camera which are around $15 to $20 each, and I would recommend steering clear of those. Let's move on to the next piece of equipment where you can save money on. And I'm talking about tripods. Just like with batteries, I wouldn't necessarily recommend always buying the cheapest tripod because tripods are super crucial. They need to be stable, they need to hold the weight of the camera, even with the heaviest lens, and they shouldn't be wobbly at all. All of this is super important for a tripod. However, I've seen tripods that cost hundreds of dollars, and for most people, spending that much money on a tripod probably isn't worth it. That's not to say that these expensive tripods are bad, but in my opinion, a relatively affordable tripod can be perfectly adequate for you. For example, I have a tripod from a brand called K&F Concept that cost me around $140 and it's super stable. It has an arm that can extend out for a top-down shot and it is tall enough for me, so it ticks basically all the boxes. Of course, there are tripods made of carbon and crafted with higher quality materials, but those can easily cost you $500 or more. While it is nice to have such a tripod, I don't think it's necessary. That said, as I mentioned with memory cards as well, I wouldn't recommend buying a $20 tripod, for example, because those can fail at the wrong moment. And if a tripod fails while your camera is on it, things can get very expensive very quickly. The next area where you might be able to save money is probably a bit controversial, but let me explain first. I'm talking about lenses. Unfortunately, when it comes to lenses, spending more money usually does get you better quality glass. But at a certain point, the difference becomes minimal and the quality improvement, while it is present, is hardly noticeable. I'm a wedding photographer, as I said, so I have almost every piece of my gear in duplicate. This is simply because I need a certain redundancy in case something breaks during a shoot. For many years, my standard zoom lens was a Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 lens. And this is a pretty affordable lens actually, so I got it for around $1,000 a few years ago. That's not super cheap, but if you compare it with a newer Sony G-Master 2470 Mark II lens, for example, and other comparable lenses, it can cost you almost 3 times as much. And yes, the Sony, for example, is better built. The edge sharpness in the photos are better and the bokeh is a bit cleaner. But is all of that really worth almost $2,000 more? That is a question that everyone has to answer for themselves. But what I'm trying to say here is that you should carefully consider what you need a lens for and whether the extra cost is actually justified in your specific case. And by the way, I still enjoy using the Tamron lens because it's significantly lighter and more compact than the Sony equivalent. In my free time, I love to shoot landscapes, and for that I often hike many kilometers or many miles through rough terrain where weight and size really matters. Another way to save a lot of money on lenses is to buy used. While I might hesitate to recommend buying used electronics in many cases, lenses are a bit different. There are many trustworthy licensed dealers out there who sell tested and used lenses, ensuring their functionality. You often get a warranty with it as well, so I see no issue on jumping on it when you find a good deal online. The last and probably most obvious way to save money on photography is simply by not buying gear you don't need. It sounds logical and pretty straightforward, but with so many different products and accessories for photographers out there, I think everyone has bought something at some point that ended up just sitting around in the closet, never to be used again. One of my favorite examples for this are color gradient filters. Sure, they can create some cool effects and looks, but with modern photo editing software, they've become almost entirely unnecessary. A personal example from my own experience would be a lightbox I bought a few years ago when I occasionally did some product photography. The lightbox barely got used because it turned out that it was way too unflexible. The items had to be the perfect size to fit into this light box, and even if they did, the setup options inside the box were really limited. So I ended up photographing every product in my usual studio setup, never using the lightbox again. There is a long list of possible products that could fall into this category, and of course every photographer is different and needs different things. But before you buy your next photo accessory, especially something that you might have seen in an influencer ad on social media, for example, think carefully about whether you really need it or not. And this brings us already to the end of today's video. If you have any other ideas about what could be added to this list of things photographers can save money on, drop them in the comments below. As I said in the beginning, I'd also love to hear from you if you disagree with something I've said in this video, and I'm actually really interested in hearing different opinions about it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed this, feel free to check out my channel where I've got a ton of other videos on photography. Thank you again and have a great day. See you next time.